You're listening to Podcasts with Park Rangers, a show where we bring to you stories of the national parks and historic sites from those who know them best, park rangers. Get to know each park ranger for their love of the parks as we discuss history, science, and the beauty of nature from a unique perspective. I'm your host, Lucas VK. Today we interview Jeff Wolin, lead interpreter at Florissant Fossil Beds National Monument in Colorado.
You know, you get out of your car and you look around, you're like, what is it? What is here? And then you spend 2 hours, you're like, whoa, Walt Disney was here? Like, what? And, the Ute were here, and this is like the biggest tree stump I've ever seen, and I can't believe that tsetse flies are, this immense story, and it's sort of hidden. Our goal is 2 hours later, they're going to leave going, wow. Wow. And that's our goal. And so I love just to see that.
Stay tuned. We'll talk about plant and insect fossils, feuding tour operators, and an empowering story about a single mother and her homestead. If you've been enjoying our podcast, we hope to keep this show on the road with your support. As little as $2 a month gets you access to bonus interview questions. Other levels get bonus episodes, invites to hike with us, and more. If you're interested in joining our exclusive community, check out our Patreon page via the show notes, or visit podcastswithparkrangers.com for more info. 34 million years ago, in what's now Colorado, stands a large lake high in the mountains. Rather than the dry, arid climate found there today, the region looks more like the humid Pacific Northwest. Imagine you're surrounded by redwood trees, 13 feet across and 200 feet tall. Some of these trees are estimated to be nearly 700 years old. Insects swarm around the lake: butterflies, bees, tsetse flies, and katydids. The sounds of the forest would be similar to the swamps of Louisiana, minus the frogs. You won't find amphibians or reptiles here. Why is that? In the distance, a volcano looms. Ash spews into the air, creating a toxic environment most amphibians and reptiles would be unable to tolerate. For many of the creatures who did live here, the ash and debris from the volcanic activity buried them as they lived a natural life and died of mostly natural causes. Today, the remains of over 1,500 different species of insect are found preserved as fossils in a layer of shale. And the redwoods? Lahar, or a mixture of volcanic debris and water akin to wet concrete, buries the base of the trees 10 feet deep. Their root system no longer has access to water and air, and the trees suffocate. These redwood behemoths die, and the top part of the trees decompose, while what lies beneath becomes petrified. Today you can see both insect fossils and petrified wood stumps at Florissant Fossil Beds National Monument. To learn more about the fossils and the unique human history around them, we sat down with Ranger Jeff Wolin.
Welcome to Florissant Fossil Beds. My name is Jeff Wolin. I'm a park ranger here, the lead interpreter, and glad you could all make it to Florissant Fossil Beds.
Growing up, Ranger Jeff wasn't initially the outdoors type. It wasn't until nearing adulthood that he found his love for nature.
I actually grew up in Illinois, in a suburb of Chicago called Elmhurst, and I was kind of a suburb kid, so not into nature at all whatsoever until after high school. And then a friend of mine took me on a trip in the boundary waters of Minnesota. And then something clicked. I don't know if it was drinking water right out of the lake, which you could do at that point, or eating fish that came out of the lake, or seeing the moose and the bears, or something clicked. And then a bunch of other things happened, but that started my trip and adventure out into nature.
Jeff was inspired to become a park ranger as an intern in college.
I started my journey in the Park Service as an intern with the Student Conservation Association, or the SCA, in 1991 at Isle Royale National Park. Back in those days, there was no online, so there was an advertisement for, hey, be an intern in a national park, and I saw it in the geography building at the University of Illinois, and I pulled off the little, postcard size thing, and I wrote in, I think, maybe I called, and I got a catalog, and I, looked through the catalog of what would be a cool internship. And by that time, I had been to the area because after high school, I had gone on a canoe trip up there. So then I picked, Isle Royale, that's up in the area I had been to. So then I went to Isle Royale, lived on a cabin on an island, a 45-mile long island in Lake Superior with moose and wolves. And I'm working in a little visitor center, greeting people coming in off plane and boat and leading tours, and just knew right away that this is it.
You're able to tap into that love of nature that you discovered earlier on.
Yeah, so a love of nature and then wanting to share that.
Yeah.
It's kind of like the two parts of it.
Excellent. Yeah. So we are here at Florissant Fossil Beds, where you've spent a good bit of this career. What's important about Florissant Fossil Beds, and what are some of the features in the landscape? Yeah,
so if a visitor is interested in coming, first they have to get to Colorado.
Yeah.
2.5 hours south of Denver, southwest, about an hour west of Colorado Springs. So one thing to realize, you'll be driving up into the mountains, and we're at about 8,500 feet. So you're going to see rolling hills of pine trees and meadows. And the hills are 300, 400, 500, 600 feet tall, rolling hills, meadows, and a beautiful landscape you can see for some miles around. And the trick is that when people come in the parking lot and they get out and they look around, they're like, what's here? Like, we know it's called Florissant Fossil Beds. We know it's a national park site, but they're looking at, it's a beautiful valley, but what's here? And when they get into the visitor center, it's a great park because we're able to kind of greet everyone and give them a little orientation about what's out here. Once you get out behind the visitor center, you're going to see some of the world's biggest petrified tree stumps of redwood trees. And then there's sort of okay, this is one of the biggest petrified tree stumps in the world. It's 10 or 12 feet wide. It's 10 feet tall. It almost looks like a miniature Devil's Tower. It weighs 90,000 pounds, kind of a whitish, grayish petrified wood, and it's huge. And then you can walk on a 1-mile trail and see more of these gigantic stumps. You still might be wondering, okay, where are the other fossils? We've also found thousands of smaller insect and leaf fossils here. It's, in fact, one of the most diverse insect sites in the world. So about 1,500 different kinds of insects. Some fish, some birds, and some mammals. And again, you won't really see these when you're outside because they're still under the ground. So when you're in that parking lot and you're looking down sort of the flat valley with the rolling hills around, you don't realize it, but you're standing on what was an ancient lake. And it was huge. It was 12 miles long. And an ancient volcano had buried the area in ash and sediments and entombed all this community that then became in the fossil record. It's one of the richest fossil deposits in the world. So the visitor, when you're here, you're going to want to go into the museum in the visitor center and see those insect and leaf fossils that had been found by paleontologists by excavating and pulling the rocks out and splitting them open and finding them. And some of them you can't even find that way because they're microscopic. So we've found pollen fossils and diatoms, which is kind of an algae, as fossils but microscopic.
Right.
Yeah.
And a lot of this is because it was a lake bed, even though you mentioned we're now at over 8,000 feet.
Right.
So there's some interesting geologic things at play here as well.
There is. And scientists think it may have actually been still a high elevation ancient lake, but in the late Eocene, so this is 34 million years ago, it was still, even though it might have been a high elevation, it's still warmer and wetter than it is today, where we have a cool temperate climate today. Back then, it was a warm temperate climate and even a little bit subtropical. For example, tsetse flies have been found here.
Really?
Yeah, palm trees. And things
evidence of all of that life that you wouldn't find now in this very arid sort of desert climate. But.
Right. Tsetse flies have also been found in Germany.
Have they?
As fossils. Right. But now in Africa today. So at some point, maybe those areas are all connected and tsetse flies are kind of all over, and then things.
Or there were migratory patterns of some sort. So we are still looking for fossils actively within the monument grounds today. Is that correct?
That's correct, yeah. It's actually part of our mission statement. When we were set aside in 1969, it was set aside to preserve and protect the geologic and paleontological sites and fossils, and also to continue to do research in a sustainable manner. So we have an active paleontology division here. We have a paleobotanist, a full-time paleobotanist, and they have a lab and collections area, and we have interns or postdoctorates working there, and we continue to do excavations. Excavations might be every few years, so it's not every year. It's not all, and definitely not all the time. It's every some years. We work with a lot of different partner groups and institutions, universities. It's active. Right now, one of the most active projects is a stump stabilization project. So, we have these big giant tree stumps, petrified trees, and many of them were excavated in the late 1800s and early 1900s when they weren't using tools that might be less damaging to the trees. So for example, dynamite. So this is before it's a national park. Let's use dynamite. So dynamite works really well, except that it damages the trees. And so now you have these trees that are cracked, and they, even from decades ago, put bands around them to try to keep, metal bands to try to keep the pieces together.
Right.
So for many years now, we've been working on stump stabilization. So we know that stumps, once they're exposed, can be damaged by freezing and thawing cycles, for example. And in Colorado, we get wide temperature variations, so you can have that.
Happens a lot.
Right out behind the visitor center, there's this weather machine, kind of looks like a alien spacecraft. So there's actually probes that go into some of the cracks of the petrified wood and measuring humidity and temperature differences, and it's taking pictures and it's measuring wind. We're working with the University of Pennsylvania and basically kind of finding out what are the variables that really can damage these trees. And then from that data, we'll be able to say, okay, in order to really keep these exposed trees together as best we can, we need some kind of shelter, and it should shelter these trees for most of the year, all of the year. The trees need to be a certain temperature. What is it? And that'll be kind of a prescription for how to protect these trees.
Okay. But first step is gathering that data.
And we're gathering, exactly.
This fancy equipment, this little space shuttle.
Exactly. Yeah.
So some of the fossils, the plant and insect ones in particular, talked about how the excavation is only done every few years. Is that because of how delicate they are? They're preserved a lot of times in shale, right?
They're very delicate fossils.
So what's the process in doing these excavations?
So they might go out to a site where they know that there's the layers of the shale, and they're going to measure off the site, down to the millimeter, and GPS, and know exactly where the site is and measure it off so they know exactly where they're at in the column as they go down, pulling out pieces and then splitting the shale with different kinds of tools. Sometimes razor blades, even like a flat razor blade to split open, and because these layers of shale can be literally as thin as paper. Paper thin shale, paper shale, they call it, in fact. Then they might have to wrap the fossils up we wrap them in toilet paper, actually. Like here's a little rock that's 3 inches by 3 inches, and it's half an inch thick, and we're going to wrap it in a big giant baseball size thing of toilet paper and then bring it back into the collections area. Temperature affects them, humidity affects them, so we have to be careful about that. So the excavations are intensive. And it takes a lot.
Like a lot goes into that.
Yeah, and so that's one reason why we might not do them all the time. It's really intensive. It also depends on what's the science going on. So, there has to be a purpose, a scientific, what's the question? What are we trying to find out? And a university would submit a application. We want to do this study, let's say, and here's why we want to do it, and here's how we'll do it, and we have to look at that before we might approve it. And if we want to do an excavation, same thing. We have to go through all of our policies about, is it sustainable? Is it in an area that's not going to impact this and that? How are we going to go about doing it? And then also, it takes a lot of space too. So it fills up, we might find hundreds and hundreds of fossils, and it can fill up drawers of space as well. Yeah.
So that's the ancient history that's preserved.
Right.
But you also mentioned that before this was preserved in the national park system, how there were people here who had discovered the stumps, and it was kind of a for-profit business.
Yeah.
So I'm curious about this because it's something that really piqued our interest.
Sure. Yeah.
With the feuding tour operators. There was a lot of tourism in this valley for a long time.
Right. So in some ways you could say, a visit to Florissant fossil beds is also going to be about the history of tourism in this area.
Mm-hmm.
So you've got late 1800s, and we have pictures of people in late 1800s clothing sitting on a stump. We've got pictures of people in the late 1800s clothing on the side of a train, the Colorado Midland Railway, that had come up, and they're in the town of Florissant, so a little bit of, like about 2 miles from here, and they're picking fossils. The train has come up specifically for them to get fossils in the summer, in the late 1800s in Colorado. Then you've got these businesses that are family run. Some of them eventually have the stumps that are right by what is now our visitor center. And some of them own some land by what's called the Big Stump, which is on the 1 mile trail.
Mm-hmm.
So competing businesses about these fossils.
Yeah.
And some amazing stories, like in the late 1800s, there was a stump and they were trying to get more people to come visit them. So they had the idea to let's saw this stump into pieces and load it on a train and get it to Chicago because it's the 1893 fair. The big fair, the World Fair in Chicago.
Yeah.
So these folks here are like, we'll cut the stump and we'll put it on a train. Well, they set up these big scaffolding and they had these gigantic saws, and they're wood saws, which works fine for wood, but not petrified wood, because petrified wood is a rock. And, might have a little bit of, microscopically original material, but basically it's a 90,000-pound rock. And so the saws don't work. And they eventually just break them off. And so you can see the little saw blades today in the trees when you go out there. And that Big Stump, it's called.
Okay.
So, you've got stuff like that. Then you've got one of the places develops into like a dude ranch. So, there's pictures of, there's a picture of some bankers from Chicago. And they're dressed up like cowboys because they've paid to come out here and stay at the dude ranch and chase around cattle. And then look for fossils, and they're hanging out, in the 1920s and 30s at Florissant. Yeah, again, before it's a park, so it's commercially run. Then things got heated. There was some competitiveness between the two businesses, and so, they've got their brochures, and they're trying to get people to stop on the highway. And at some point, a dispute breaks out where someone from one of the businesses, and these businesses are just down the road from each other. I mean, they're like the land is abutting each other.
Yeah, they're neighbors.
They're neighbors, yeah.
Uh-huh.
And so at some point, one of them puts nails out on the road to try to not have people go to the other site, but go to their site. And then as the story goes, and you'll hear different versions, the other people, one of the people working there, and the latest story I heard was, a young ranch hand that was a little bit of a hothead, shoots at the other person.
Oh boy.
And then depending on the story, either, I forget what part of the body it goes through, but it just depends on, they end up going to the hospital because, the guy gets shot.
Yeah.
And you just hear different accounts of, how badly was he wounded is basically, there are different stories about that. But it pretty much seems like
he was wounded and ended up in the
someone shot at
hospital
someone
over
else
this.
and someone got hurt, and it wasn't, it was heated. And then, another famous story, 1956, right here where we're sitting today is near where there was a little farmhouse basically, and they were running the stumps behind here, which is now where our visitor center is. And big black limousine pulls up, guy comes out, end of the day, there's a young teenager who's running the store, and the guy comes in from the limousine and he's like, hey, wanted to buy some petrified wood. So the teenager's like, well, we've got this piece, it's $30, and we got this piece and it's $20. And the guy said, no, I want a stump. I want to buy a whole stump. And so the teenager's like, well, let me get the owner. And so this guy turns out to be Walt Disney.
Uh-huh.
And so he's building his park in California. And sometimes the story is that he's buying a present for his wife. And, it's a stump. And I don't know if she wants it or not, but he buys it anyway. And you can see it like right now, 2018, if you fly out to Disneyland and visit like the frontier area, there's like the paddle boat and down by the water, and there's a stump, and it's got like a fence around it, and flowers and landscaping, and there's a little plaque, from Florissant, Colorado. So yeah, so there's a really colorful tourist history here.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, yeah, that tourism history really sticks with you when you hear a bit about it. So prior to all this craziness that was going on with the competing factions, with the tourism and with the Dude Ranch, this land had other human history.
Yeah.
Kind of goes back to the Homesteaders Act. So there were some homesteaders that were coming to this area that were basically allowed to get land from the government for very cheap.
Yeah, the actual under the Homestead Act, so 1862, there's a Homestead Act. You have to prove up the land. So you've got to improve it, meet some certain requirements, have a building that's a certain, and it doesn't have to be a very big building, but a building with a certain, a door and a certain amount of windows and a certain amount of land, up to 160 acres. And then the filing fee, I think it was like $14 or something like that. And then you could prove up the land and then it's yours.
Right.
Yeah. The Homestead Act.
Okay.
Yeah.
There's one particular area that's preserved out there that is Adeline Hornbeck's homestead.
Right. So,
am I pronouncing her name right?
So in the monument is Adeline Hornbeck.
Okay.
It's a 1878 homestead, and it's on the National Register. So it's part of the park. It's on the National Register. It's an 1878 building, more or less in the original location, more or less with most of the original pieces of it, the wood, and we've had to do some work to it to stabilize it and keep it in good shape. So we've replaced the roof and we've replaced windows, and I think early on they helped with the foundation. It's right off the road, so it's kind of neat. If you're in the area, you can just pull into the parking lot and walk down there and peek in the windows and walk around. There's some exhibits down there. In the summer, we open it up from usually in the middle of the day. And so Adeline Hornbeck, it's an amazing story. She was from Massachusetts. She moves across the country to work in a trading post in Oklahoma. Along the way, so she's married then. Then she moves to Denver. And her first husband dies at a young age. Then she's got land in Denver. She gets married again. She loses her land in Denver to a big flood. Ends up in Colorado Springs. Second husband kind of disappears. Actually, no one really knows exactly what happened there, but second husband sort of disappears out of the historical record. And then she comes to Florissant, single mom, 4 kids, 1878, tweens, young teens. Yeah. Trying to make a living, trying to find a better life, and starts a homestead. Ends up having one of the bigger homestead's houses, a beautiful house. I think it's got more square footage than my house. It's got 1.5 stories, much bigger than the normal homestead house of that time in this valley. Right. And if that's not enough, all these experiences she's been through, loss of 2 husbands, loss of property, left family in Massachusetts, left people in Oklahoma, met new people, mom, raising kids, running a homestead. She's also on the school board and helps in the local store. So she's quite the woman. Quite the achiever there, yeah. And so the bigger story there, there's just many stories. So there's a story about overcoming adversity. There's a story about opportunity, and in particular for women at that time, to own land. And so the Homestead Act ends up providing an opportunity for women who are the head of their household, which she was. And under the law, it said if you're the head of household. And so the Homestead Act offers an opportunity for these women, in many cases throughout the West, to own land and be a big part of their community. Wow. Yeah. It's fantastic. Yeah, and it's a good reminder, and it's good to have a physical reminder out there. Yeah. As you say, it's right off the road, so anyone who comes to visit can explore that and kind of get back in touch with that time period and with her story. I've had, it's popping in my head now. I'll never forget, but a mom showed up, a single mom, young single mom shows up. I didn't know this, but I'm doing my tour and we're with folks, and I might have asked some question about, what kind of experiences have you had trying to find a better life or something like that. And this woman says, I'm a single mom, and I'm actually standing here because every year I come to this homestead and I look around and I know that if Adeline can do it, then I should be able to do it. So that was kind of a cool little thing that happened. Wow. Yeah.
That's pretty poignant, actually.
Yeah.
So yeah, she was a self-made woman,
Right.
and
Now,
inspires others,
Yeah.
even current generations.
And one more thing I want to mention on human history, because I often get the question, people come in and they'll say, who discovered the fossils? And I always want to be clear that the hunters and gatherers that were here, we've got projectile points that probably date back 5,000 or 7,000 years.
Mm-hmm.
So bands of hunters and gatherers coming through this area. We have dozens of tribes that are affiliated with the area. Certainly we know the Ute were here, but Arapaho and Apache and other tribes are affiliated with the area. Cheyenne, other tribes. We have a big list. So they were here. This was a traditional hunting grounds of many different groups. And when they came through the valley, they would have seen petrified wood lying around, chunks, logs, maybe half stumps.
Yeah.
And I always think in my mind, and I don't know if this is right, but some hunter-gatherer kid, maybe 4,000 years ago, the first group that comes through the area, and there's some kid on a hillside just digging around and is going to find a piece of shale and opens it up and sees the image of a leaf or an insect. They were the first ones to discover the fossils, In the 1870s, science comes and they start writing stuff down and it gets recorded, sure.
Yeah.
But people knew about it for a long time.
Yeah. It's prehistory, but certainly a human discovery.
We don't know necessarily exactly what they thought of it or how they felt about the fossils, but, we know that they would have seen them.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah, good point. More about maybe the conservation efforts, because I think we talked about some of it tangentially.
How it became a monument?
Didn't have a specific question. So yeah, how did this first get that national monument designation?
Well, and I think this is an important piece of the conservation. That's why I mentioned it. We were talking about conservation. So how did it even get to be a place that we even have this mission to conserve and protect these fossils?
Right.
Well, it turns out that it was a landmark environmental law case. And so in the late 1960s, some developers had bought land on what is now the fossil beds. And they were going to build a housing development. And there were other tracts of land, but maybe more rural, so ranches, but it was all privately owned. And again, there were the two commercial operations. So you got the commercial operations, you got some ranch land, you got maybe a few A-frames here and there, and then a big section gets bought up for development. That spurred into motion a grassroots effort to try to protect it. And in particular, there was a woman named Estella Leopold, who's Dr. Estella Leopold, so she's a geologist. Mm-hmm. And in the 60s, she's here in Colorado, and she's forms this group called the Defenders of Florissant, and they end up hiring someone named Victor Yannicone Jr., who's ends up being one of the founding people in environmental law in the country. This is the 60s, so it's the environmental movement. So there's a lot of, even culturally, a lot going on with, hey, we should be doing more for the environment, Mm-hmm. So they end up they have a legal team, including two brothers, one of which became the governor of Colorado. They've got this grassroots group. They're hooking up with other organizations and outdoor organizations and organizations interested in public lands, and they go into court. And they're basically arguing that even though it's private land, that for the good of the public, for the future, that it would be better protected as a national monument. And there's a bill in Congress, and so it comes down to the summer of 1969. There's a bill moving through Congress, but it's not totally through. They're going through the courts. They're trying to fight for this. The housing development has, they've bought the land, and at one point the bulldozers are even here on the land, and the bill's still not passed, and people are trying to figure out what to do. And it really came down to final moments, but it became a national monument.
Wow.
But it gets into a little bit of an interesting area, and the lawyers knew that, where they're saying, here's an area that was private land. And then it's this question of, when does the good of the public outweigh the good of the individual? So they ended up paying people for the land, and also this is what's happening. It's becoming a national monument. Mm-hmm. And so...
Now you say that was through a bill in Congress?
Yeah.
Because as we've talked about on a previous episode,
Yeah.
I think episode number 3,
Yeah.
Wendy told us usually a national monument is by presidential proclamation.
So there can be 2 different ways you can get a national monument.
Okay.
So Congress can write a law and make one, and the president signs it, but they've
Sure.
written the law. So Nixon signed the one here. And there's also with the Antiquities Act. The Antiquities Act of 1906 allows a president to make a national monument.
Okay.
Right.
So that's how a lot of the first ones were brought about, was
Right.
through that Antiquities Act.
That's right. And that was sort of a thing of like necessity. Like, hey, these areas are getting damaged heavily, really quickly. We need a way to very quickly protect them.
Right.
How do we do that? Oh, Antiquities Act.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
So Rocky Mountain National Park is a huge one that is nearby.
Mhm.
It's a huge draw, but it's actually several hours from here.
Correct.
Colorado Springs, which is a major city,
Right.
is 35 miles away from here.
Right.
And in a news article that we found,
Mhm.
you said, and I quote, "If I could put up a billboard, it would have a big arrow and say, 'Your closest national park unit is just up the hill.'"
Yeah.
What do you think is the value in having smaller parks like Florissant fossil beds in addition to those huge units?
Yeah. Good question. I mean, I guess the first thing I would say is these parks were set aside because the American people at some point deemed them to be significant enough that they should be set aside.
Yes.
In this case, it's one of the richest fossil deposits in the world, but it teaches us a lot about our own current times. So we learn from the past,
Yeah.
Changes occurred on the planet in the past, and changes continue to occur, and how do we adapt to these changes, is something we might look to this park to learn. So I think the small parks, depending on their story, can really, all these parks collectively tell our history of our country, and it tells about what we've learned, what we've struggled with, what we value, what is important to us as a people, and lessons for us in the future. And so size could be small or big, and they're all going to have some aspect of that.
Yeah. There's always a significance. There's a reason for these designations.
That's exactly right. Yeah.
So what is your favorite thing about this unit, about Florissant Fossil Beds National Monument?
Tough question. A few things pop into mind. So I pull in every morning and I get out of my car in this parking lot and I look down the Florissant Valley and I'm just so grateful. It's beautiful and I just can't believe that I'm here. And I know that underneath the valley there's this amazing story, and I guess I'm a bit of a rock nerd. And what ends up happening is over the years I've learned that there's so much here that's beyond what you would just see. Like when the visitors come, you get out of your car and you look around, you're like, what is it? What is here?
Mm-hmm.
And then you spend 2 hours, you're like, whoa, Walt Disney was here? Like,
right.
What? And, the Ute were here, and this is like the biggest tree stump I've ever seen, and I can't believe that tsetse flies are, this immense story, and it's sort of hidden, so it is kind of like a hidden gem. So I do like that aspect of it, and I always tell our staff, our goal is that we're going to take them from, they come into the parking lot, they get out, they kind of look at the valley, and they're like, huh, what? And 2 hours later, they're going to leave going, wow. Wow.
Mm-hmm.
And that's our goal. And so I love just to see that.
Yeah. So you have been at this park for some time. We talked about it, almost 2 decades. There must be something that really speaks to you on a personal level, because I hear that there are stories under these layers. What feelings come up when you think of the fossil beds and the national monument here? What makes it special to you?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot in there. I mean, and one of the things I have to mention is, I live with my family. So my wife and my son and I, and we live nearby.
Yeah.
And so we love it here. So just as a family, it's just like, this is a great place to live.
Yeah.
So that is part of it. And another funny story is, I'll tell you, when I first accepted this job, my wife and I, we were in Utah, and we had decided we wanted to move closer to family in Chicago, but still be in a cool place. And then the job opened up and I saw like, hey, look, it's on the edge of the Rocky Mountains, but we can see the Great Plains. There's an airport. and the job seemed like a cool job.
Mm-hmm.
And I like rocks. I was a geography major, not geology, but geography. I like rocks, but I never had dinosaur phase. So like I wouldn't consider myself, fossil geek. And a famous quote in our family is when they offered me the job and I said on the phone, and I said, hey, can we come out and, meet you and take a look? I hung up the phone and I turned and looked at my wife, and my sister and her husband were there at the time visiting in Utah. And I said, do I even like fossils? Meaning like, I'm not a fossil nerd. This seems like a fossil park. How will I do?
Yeah.
And I had other people tell me, oh, Florissant is way too small. Jeff, you'll only last a few years there and you'll want to move on. So here we are, 16 years later, almost. And there's so much I love about the park. I love the team. I love the people I work with. I love working with visitors and meeting folks. I love people. So visitors come in, love chatting with them from all over the world, all people of all backgrounds, and sharing things with them and having them have their own discoveries and see that happen. I do like the fossil story, and I have become kind of a fossil geek now. And so, I find myself geeking out about fossils now.
Oh, really?
But why? Because the bigger picture is it's like when you come to a park like this, you get the big perspective. You realize you're a part of something bigger. I guess that's for me, it's, this whole history of the earth and how things have moved around and things have changed and the space and the time of it. You're a part of it. And so I feel that here. And then I just like to be a part of a team that does cool stuff, So over the years, we've done a lot of good, cool stuff here, and it feels great to be a part of that.
Yeah, there's a lot of cool stuff going on here.
And I'll tell my staff, straight up, like, we're here to make the world a better place. That is our job. And so that's a lot of purpose.
So you mentioned the Junior Ranger program, which you're very enthused about. You also play music, and have written a couple of albums of kid songs, I guess you could call them. We listened to a few, and we were jamming. Yeah,
we call it the genre is Junior Ranger music.
Junior Ranger
that's
music.
The genre of music, yeah.
So this album is called Songs for Junior Ranger.
Right.
It's basically to help kids learn about the national parks. So what inspired you to write these songs to help kids connect?
So the music thing's always been around in my family. So my mom was into music, and supposedly my mom says I used to make up songs in the shower. Like she'd hear me like just making up songs.
Oh, really?
Supposedly. Then my first foray into it was actually I was volunteering in college at a nature center, and they said, "Hey Jeff, would you dress up as a dinosaur and sing music to kids?" And I was like, "Yeah, sure." So I took some songs, I won't mention the artists, but I took some songs from musical artists that probably everyone would know at that time in the mid-90s, and just changed the words for kids.
Okay.
And just used that music. So, anyway, so that was started that. And then I had discovered certain bands. There's a Banana Slug string band. There's some science teachers out of California, and they're doing science music. And I was like, oh, okay, so this is a thing. People do this kind of music. So then years go by, I use my guitar. I've got my guitar in the office. We're looking at it right now. I've got a spare one in that drawer over there just in case.
Oh, okay.
So, music has always been part of our repertoire as interpreters. Story, poems, music for some.
Yeah.
Ranger around the campfire kind of thing.
There you go.
It's always been around. And music, as you know, is a huge tool for people. It's part of it's being human. It's part of being human, right?
Yeah.
Rhythms, stories in songs. And so it's one of the ways we learn. I'm not going to do it, but I could start singing songs from the 70s from commercials, but I won't. But they're still in my head, right?
Yeah.
And Schoolhouse Rock, right?
Mm-hmm.
I grew up with that. Yeah.
It works its way into your psyche.
Conjunction, junction, what's your function? So anyway, one day my son, he had started doing Junior Ranger, and I was sitting in the living room, and I was like, man, someone should write a Junior Ranger song. I'm like, I'll write a Junior Ranger song. So I wrote a Junior Ranger song, and then I called at some point, I called the Washington office because I had friends that worked in DC that were with the Junior Ranger program. And I sang the song into the phone, like, hey, listen to this, and set the phone on the table and just like sang the song into the phone. And then she writes back, hey, that's pretty good. Like, send us a better version. So I recorded it as best I could. I'm not a sound engineer, but I did the best I could and sent it. And they're like, this is really pretty good. Could you record it even better? And they're like, we'll give you like a little bit of money. So I was able to get a little bit of money, and I found a local band here, and we recorded it professionally,
Okay, yeah.
And
Found
then
the studio
sent it to them. Yeah, and sent it to them. And I don't remember exactly how this happened, but I might have jokingly said, here's a song, and let's do a concert somewhere. And somehow it came up, on the National Mall, let's do a concert. And so we did a concert on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial. And so we arranged, and I went out there and we arranged to have it. And so for me to have a concert of Junior Ranger music, I had to write more songs.
Yeah.
So like
you just had the one.
Right. I had one. So I'm like, I need a whole like set list, right? So I had to write all these other songs, and then that started it. So then it was like, okay, this is like a thing.
Sure.
And then I was at a conference, and I was singing music just like in a break room or something, and a guy comes up to me and he goes, hey, my name's Matt, and I'm at New Orleans Jazz National Historical Park. And I was like, oh yeah, heard of New Orleans Jazz.
Yeah.
And he's like, what you doing? I'm like, I'm just singing these kid songs I write. He's like, we can make that into music. Like, that's what we do. We're New Orleans Jazz National Historical Park. And I was like, oh. So we started talking about it, and we ended up getting grant money and working with all these different partners, and made Songs for Junior Rangers Volume 1. And then in 2016, so that was 2012, and in 2016 we made Songs for Junior Rangers Volume 2. And so it was great. It's been one of the greatest joys of my life, has been doing the music thing. And so we'll play concerts here at Florissant. I've been lucky enough to travel to different parks, played at Mount Rushmore, played in Saguaro, played at Olympic and different places, and Junior Ranger concerts.
Yeah.
So, which is kind of like a workout. That's my plan, is I write songs that have movement to them, that we're learning, we're having fun, it's good music. Like, it might be blues or it might be jazz, like it's a real kind of music. It could be Cajun, it could be hip hop, it could be some kind of music form.
We've noticed there's a lot of variety.
Yeah, it's like real music. Yeah. And then, but it's fun, and they're dancing around. So like, at a Junior Ranger concert, the kids are going to be acting out, they're crawling in a cave, they're bison, and by the end, they're like, man, it's a little bit of workout, and like, that's kind of the plan. Yeah.
You've obviously done a lot of traveling through this music to different national parks. You've had a lifelong connection to the national parks system, both as a ranger and prior to that. So what is the importance of the national park system to you, and why do you feel it's important to preserve this idea within America?
I guess it goes back to what I tell my staff, is it's making the world a better place. In some of the most recent foundations of interpretation, so the standards that we as interpreters have, and in some of the first paragraphs, it's talking about making the world a just place, socially and environmentally a just world. And so I think it makes a better society, it makes a better world when you've got people that are stewards of the land, of the history. We're learning lessons from the past and how to make our world a better place, how to make it better for everyone, as best we can. And it's to have open spaces and places to ponder and look at the stars and think about being part of something bigger is important. I think even to the health of the world. If people can come out and I've got a guy that hikes a trail every week because Doc said, this is where you need to hike. Like, that's his prescription, is you hike. And he lives down the road. And so he's healing here. And I think in a bigger scale, these are places of healing for recreation. There's studies that have been done about the power of awe, AWE. And it turns out that when, they hook people up to probes and they put them in places of awe versus not places of awe, and they tend to be kinder to each other, and they tend to want to give more and be healthier. Like that's what awe does. And so I think that that's important as well. So I guess to sum up, it's making the world a better place.
Yeah.
By having these places.
That's a good way to expand on what seems like a cliche term, but it truly is making the world a better place.
Yeah. And I think if the good spreads, so if someone comes to Florissant and something clicks in them, they learn something new, they get inspired, and then they go somewhere else and they've got that spark of inspiration with them, and the good travels. Lots of people in the park involved in national parks, including the visitors that come. Like we all have stake in this game.
Yes, we're all stewards.
Right?
Yeah.
And so I always think about that. There's no end to the good that will come of this because it just ripples out.
Are you inspired to spread the good after a visit to our national parks? We want to share with you the enthusiasm Ranger Jeff has spread through his career with a fitting close to this episode, a song for the junior ranger in all of us.
All across the earth you can find the evidence of ancient life. Prehistoric puzzle made out of stone. Fossils tell us stories about our home. Hey, what do you say? Let's have a national fossil day. Think about the Earth's prehistory. Study paleontology.
If you enjoyed what you heard, review us on iTunes or your favorite podcast provider and help us improve the show. For more interview content with Ranger Jeff about the variety of life at the fossil beds, early settlers finding the petrified wood stumps, and other behind-the-scenes content, join our Patreon community. As little as $2 a month gets you access to bonus interview questions. A link is posted in our show notes or visit podcastswithparkrangers.com. Stay with us through the final minutes for a short preview of our next episode. We like to highlight on our show ways that a typical park visitor can give back to their national parks. Currently, Florissant Fossil Beds isn't taking individual volunteers, but if you are part of a large group that would like to donate their time, Ranger Jeff would be glad to hear from you. You can reach Jeff at 719-748-3253, extension 202. Even though we interview park rangers, we are not affiliated with the National Park Service, and any views expressed are not necessarily those of the Park Service. We're just fans of the national parks, like you. Coming up in episode 9 of Podcasts with Park Rangers, we travel north to Rocky Mountain National Park to meet with Ranger Cynthia Languth to talk about the Alpine Tundra and what it's like working at the highest visitor center in the park system at an elevation of nearly 12,000 feet. Every year, the team at Rocky digs out the building from under 10 to 20 feet of snow. It's going to be one chilly episode.